Nobody tells you the exact moment you stop being a child. For most people, it happens slowly, a gradual fading, like sunlight leaving a room in the evening. For me, it happened on a Tuesday morning in February of 1936, when the headmistress of the Harwood Home for Orphaned Girls in Roanoke, Virginia, sat me down in her office and told me that my father's cousin, a man named Arlo Gentry, the last living relative anyone could find, had died of a stroke, and that in his will he had left me his property in Crabtree Hollow, up in the mountains of Giles County. "What property?" I asked. Mrs. Phelps looked at me over her glasses with the expression she reserved for delivering bad news she found slightly amusing. 7 acres of hillside, a cabin, and a well. A well? A dried-up well, she clarified, as if the distinction between a well and a dried-up well was the most important detail in the world. And maybe it was, because a well with water is a home. A well without water is a grave you haven't fallen into yet. I was 15 years old. My name was Alma Gentry, and I had been at the Harwood home since I was 8. When my mother died of influenza during the winter of 1929, and my father, a man so broken by grief that he couldn't look at me without seeing her, had driven me to the front steps, kissed my forehead, and walked away. He died 3 years later in a logging camp in North Carolina. They sent me a letter. I didn't cry. I had already used up every tear I had the day he left me on those steps. 7 years at the Harwood home had taught me 3 things: how to sew a straight seam, how to endure silence, and how to disappear into a book so completely that the walls around me stopped existing. I was the girl who read the encyclopedia at night, the girl who borrowed the science teacher's botany textbook and didn't return it for 6 months, the girl who once drew a map of every tree species on the Harwood grounds and got punished for wasting paper on nonsense. I was strange. I was quiet. And now I was the owner of 7 acres and a dry hole in the ground. The girls at Harwood laughed. The staff shook their heads. Mrs. Phelps signed my discharge papers with the efficiency of someone closing a file she was tired of maintaining. If you want to find out what I discovered at the bottom of that dried-up well, and why it turned out to be worth more than every working well in the valley combined, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what Arlo Gentry had been sitting on top of for 30 years without knowing it is a story that still feeds families in those mountains today. A mail carrier named Floyd took me as far as Pembroke in his truck. From there, I walked 9 miles up a road that started as gravel and ended as a footpath through hemlocks so tall and dark they turned afternoon into twilight. Crabtree Hollow was the kind of place that Virginia forgot on purpose, a narrow valley carved between 2 ridges, with a creek that ran through the bottom, and a handful of cabins scattered along the slopes like afterthoughts. Arlo Gentry's place was at the top of the hollow, where the path gave up entirely and the hillside steepened into rock. The cabin was small, 1 room and a loft, built from logs that had silvered with age but hadn't rotted. The roof was cedar shake, patched in places with tin. A stone chimney leaned slightly eastward but held, and behind the cabin, sitting in a small clearing surrounded by bare winter oaks, was the well. It was a round stone structure, about 4 feet across, built from stacked limestone blocks without mortar. A wooden frame held a rusted pulley and a frayed rope that ended in nothing, no bucket, no hook, just a frayed end dangling into darkness. Someone had placed a flat stone over the opening, and on that stone, scratched into the surface with a nail or a knife, were the words, "No water. Don't bother." I leaned over the edge and looked down. Blackness. I dropped a pebble and listened. No splash. just a faint tap of stone on stone, maybe 2 seconds later. The well was perhaps 50 or 60 feet deep, and at the bottom there was nothing but rock. Or so everyone believed. Inside the cabin, I found the usual remnants of a solitary mountain life: a cot, a stove, a table, an axe, canned goods, a rifle. But I also found something I didn't expect. Arlo Gentry had been a reader. The cabin's single shelf held 24 books, mostly about geology and mining and the history of Giles County, and tucked between a book on limestone formations and a U.S. Geological Survey report from 1923, I found a hand-drawn map. It was crude but careful. It showed the hollow from above, with the ridges on either side, the creek at the bottom, and the location of every well and spring in the valley. Most were marked with blue dots, active water sources, but 3 were marked with red X's, dried up. And next to the red X marking Arlo's well, in small, cramped handwriting, were the words, "Dry since 1931. Water table dropped or redirected. See USGS report page 47. I pulled the USGS report off the shelf. Page 47 described the geology of the upper Crabtree Hollow area. The language was technical, but after 6 months with a stolen botany textbook and a habit of reading anything I could get my hands on, I could follow it. The report explained that the hollow sat on a limestone karst formation, porous rock riddled with underground channels and cavities carved by water over millions of years. It noted that several wells in the upper hollow had gone dry in the late 1920s and early 1930s, likely due to a shift in the underground water table caused by natural geological changes, or, more probably, by the blasting operations at the Bald Knob coal mine 3 miles to the east. The blasting had cracked something underground. The water hadn't disappeared. It had found a new path, and Arlo Gentry, in the last notation on his map, had written, "The water is still there. It went deeper. If someone went down to the bottom, they might find where it went." The first month was survival. I won't romanticize it. March in the Virginia mountains is beautiful from a distance and brutal up close. The cabin stove worked, but ate wood faster than I could split it. The canned goods lasted 2 weeks. After that, I ate what the forest offered. Ramps so strong they burned my throat, chickweed that tasted like nothing, dandelion roots I boiled into a bitter soup that kept me alive but didn't make me grateful. I lost weight I didn't have. My hands cracked and bled from splitting firewood with an axe that was too heavy for me. And every day, I looked at the well. The nearest working water source was the creek at the bottom of the hollow, a half-mile walk downhill, which meant a half-mile walk uphill with a full bucket, twice a day. Within a week, my shoulders ached so badly I couldn't lift my arms above my head. The creek was reliable but inconvenient, and every time I made that climb, I thought about the well sitting dry and useless 30 feet from my door. By April, I had a plan. It was a stupid plan, the kind of plan that only a desperate 15-year-old with nothing to lose would come up with. I was going to go down into the well. I spent a week preparing. I repaired the pulley frame and replaced the rope with a longer one I'd found coiled in Arlo's woodshed. Maybe 80 feet of hemp rope, still strong. I fashioned a harness from leather straps and a board to sit on. I made a torch from rags and pine pitch. And on a clear April morning, with the dogwoods blooming white on the ridge above me and the whole hollow smelling of spring, I lowered myself into the darkness. The first 40 feet were just stone. The well was expertly built. The limestone blocks fitted tight, dry, cold to the touch. My torch flickered in the updraft. The circle of sky above me shrank to the size of a dinner plate, then a saucer, then a coin. The air grew cooler with every foot, from the warmth of the spring morning to a steady, subterranean chill that settled into my bones. At 50 feet, the stonework ended. Below the last course of cut blocks, the well shaft continued as a natural fissure in the bedrock, rough, uneven, narrowing to about 3 feet across. Arlo, or whoever had dug the original well, had followed a natural crack in the limestone down to the water table, then lined the upper portion with stone. When the water table dropped, the well went dry, and everyone assumed that was the end of the story. It wasn't. At 55 feet, I felt it. Not water, air. A lateral breeze, cold and damp, blowing from my left. I swung my torch toward it and saw what I'd been hoping for. An opening in the well shaft wall. A horizontal crack, maybe 3 feet high and 2 feet wide, leading sideways into the rock. I squeezed through. The passage ran about 15 feet before it opened into a chamber that made me gasp so sharply the torch nearly went out. It was a cavern. Natural, roughly oval, about 30 feet long and 20 feet wide, with a ceiling of smooth limestone hung with small stalactites that glittered in the torchlight like a constellation turned upside down. The floor was limestone too, worn smooth by centuries of water, and along the far wall, seeping from a crack that ran floor to ceiling, was water. Not a pool, not a puddle. A steady flow, emerging from the rock face and running across the chamber floor into a channel that disappeared into the darkness at the cavern's lower end. The water was clear as glass and so cold that when I knelt and put my hand in it, the cold traveled up my arm and into my chest like a bright, sharp wire. I cupped my palms and drank. It tasted of stone and minerals and deep time, the taste of water that hadn't seen sunlight in 1,000 years. But the water wasn't the discovery, not the real one. Because as I raised the torch higher and let its light fill the chamber, I saw what was growing along the banks of that underground stream, growing in the wet limestone gravel, growing in crevices and depressions where centuries of mineral-rich water had deposited a thin, dark, impossibly fertile soil. Plants. Green, living plants, growing 55 feet underground. Not mushrooms, not fungi. Plants, with leaves and stems and roots, pale and elongated from the darkness, but unmistakably alive. Watercress, thick and lush, choking the edges of the stream. Ferns, maidenhair ferns, their delicate fronds trembling in the air current. And something else, something I didn't recognize at first. Long, trailing vines with small white flowers, climbing the damp walls of the cavern as if reaching for a sun they had never known. I sat in that cavern, 55 feet underground, surrounded by an impossible garden, and I understood. The well hadn't just been a well, it was a doorway, and what lay at the bottom wasn't emptiness. It was life, stubborn, improbable, miraculous life, thriving in a place where no one had thought to look because everyone had taken the words scratched on the stone cover at face value. No water, don't bother. The biggest lie in Crabtree Hollow, written on a rock. Getting out was harder than getting in. I climbed that rope with arms that shook from cold and excitement, scraped my knees raw on the well shaft, and collapsed on the grass beside the well opening, with my heart hammering and my mind on fire. I spent the next 2 weeks doing nothing but thinking, reading, planning. I went through Arlo's geology books and the USGS report again with new eyes. The underground stream I'd found was almost certainly the redirected water table, the same water that had once fed the well and every other dry well in the upper hollow. The mine blasting had cracked a new channel, sending the water deeper and sideways into the cavern. The plants growing down there had likely started from seeds and spores carried by the water itself, deposited in the mineral-rich sediment, and sustained by the small amount of light that filtered down through the well shaft during certain hours of the day. A faint, reflected glow that was enough, barely, for the hardiest species. But if I could increase the light, if I could find a way to direct more sunlight down the shaft and into the cavern, the growing potential was extraordinary. The water was constant. The temperature was stable. The mineral content of the limestone sediment was rich. All that was missing was light. My grandmother's generation would have called it impossible. But I had spent 7 years reading everything I could find, and one of the books I'd read at Harwood, a battered copy of a French agricultural manual from 1898, had described a technique used in the Paris underground mushroom farms. Mirrors and light shafts, angled to redirect sunlight into subterranean spaces. I started with one mirror. A small hand mirror I'd found in Arlo's cabin, probably his mother's. I mounted it on a wooden bracket at the top of the well shaft, angled to catch the morning sun and bounce it downward. The effect was modest, a pale rectangle of light that traveled about 20 feet into the shaft before fading. But it was a beginning. The first person to help me was Virgil Sloan. Virgil was 64, a retired miner with a bad back and good hands. He lived alone in a cabin at the bend of the creek, and he'd known Arlo for decades. He found me one morning rigging a second mirror to a frame I'd built over the well, and he stood watching with his arms crossed and his head tilted, the way a man watches something he doesn't understand but can't look away from. "What in God's name are you doing, girl?" I told him. I told him about the cavern, the stream, the plants, the mirrors. I told him my plan to expand the underground garden, to use the well as an access shaft, to build a pulley system for lowering soil and supplies and raising crops. He listened without interrupting, which is a rare quality in a man from those mountains. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "Your cousin Arlo talked about that well every day of his life," Virgil said. "Said there was something down there. People told him he was crazy. A dried-up well is a dried-up well, they said. Nothing to be done." "He was right," I said. "He was always right. Just never brave enough to climb down and prove it." Virgil uncrossed his arms. "I know where there's a dozen mirrors in the old Bald Knob Company store. They shut it down last year. Nobody's claimed the stock." He came back the next day with 14 mirrors of various sizes, a coil of wire, and his toolbox. By midsummer of 1936, the cavern was transformed. Virgil and I built a mirror array, a series of angled reflectors mounted on adjustable frames, running from the well's rim down the shaft and through the lateral passage into the chamber. It wasn't elegant. The mirrors were mismatched. Shaving mirrors, hand mirrors, a cracked dressing table mirror, 2 rectangular mirrors from the company store. But when the sun was right, 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the afternoon, the light cascaded down that shaft and into the cavern in a pale golden stream that made the stalactites sparkle and lit up the underground garden like a church on Christmas morning. The watercress exploded. With more light, it spread across the stream banks until I had to thin it to keep the water flowing. I planted lettuce, spinach, and kale in beds I'd built from stones and filled with a mix of the cavern's mineral sediment and composted leaf litter carried down from the surface. The cave's steady temperature, 54 degrees year-round, was too cool for summer crops, but perfect for cold-tolerant greens, and the limestone-filtered water was so pure and mineral-rich that the plants grew with a vigor that would have been remarkable even in the best surface soil. I also discovered something about the cavern that changed everything. It had a natural ventilation system. The well shaft acted as a chimney, drawing fresh air down through the lateral passage and up through the chamber. This constant airflow prevented the stagnant, carbon dioxide-heavy atmosphere that kills most underground growing attempts. The cavern breathed. It was, in the truest sense, alive. By September, I was harvesting fresh greens from 55 feet underground. I carried them up the well shaft in baskets hooked to the pulley rope. Pale, tender lettuce and spinach, and kale that tasted faintly of minerals, like the water itself. They were beautiful. They were impossible. And when I walked 9 miles to Pembroke and set them on a table at the Saturday market, fresh greens in September, in the mountains, from a girl nobody knew, people looked at me like I was selling magic. "Where'd you get these?" asked a woman named Clara Marsh, turning a head of lettuce in her hands with the careful suspicion of someone who'd been disappointed too many times. "I grew them," I said. "In this heat? Where?" "Underground." She laughed. Then she looked at the lettuce again. How crisp it was, how clean, how impossibly fresh for a dry September in the mountains. And she stopped laughing. She bought 2 heads, told her neighbors. Her neighbors told their neighbors. By October, I was selling out before noon, and people I'd never met were making the walk up to Crabtree Hollow just to see the girl who grew food inside the earth. The winter of 1936 was when the garden proved its real worth. Every farm in the valley shut down. Every garden died back. Root cellars held last season's potatoes and canned beans and not much else. The first snow came in November and didn't leave until March, burying the hollow under a silence so thick you could hear your own heartbeat. And 55 feet below my cabin, the underground garden kept growing. 54 degrees, year-round, indifferent to the blizzards above. The mirrors caught what thin winter light there was, less than summer, but enough. The stream never froze, never slowed. The greens kept coming, pale and sweet and alive in a world that had gone gray and still. I carried baskets to Pembroke through the snow. People who had been curious in September were desperate by January. A woman whose husband was sick with pneumonia begged me for fresh greens. Anything green, anything alive, because the doctor said he needed vitamins, and there were no vitamins to be had in a mountain winter. I gave her a bag of spinach and watercress and charged her nothing. Word reached the upper hollow. Families who had ignored me, or worse, laughed about the city girl living on Arlo Gentry's dead land, started appearing at my cabin. They came for the greens, but they stayed for the water, because I had also solved the well problem. With Virgil's help, I'd rigged a pipe from the underground stream up through the well shaft to a hand pump at the surface. For the first time in 5 years, there was water at the top of Crabtree Hollow. Clean, cold, constant water that flowed when every other well in the upper valley was dry or struggling. I never turned anyone away. Not the family who had called Arlo crazy to his face. Not the woman at the Pembroke store who had looked at me with pity when I first arrived. Not anyone. Virgil asked me about it once, the way Ida and Harlan and Ezekiel ask in every story about a girl who gives more than the world gave her. They didn't help you when you needed it, he said. Why help them? Because that's not the point, I said. The well didn't ask who deserved the water. It just gave it. I want to be like the well. By 1940, the underground garden had become something that attracted attention beyond Crabtree Hollow. The county agricultural agent, a man named Bernard Kraft, came to see it after hearing rumors he didn't believe. I lowered him down the well shaft on the pulley board, and when he reached the cavern and saw the rows of greens growing in reflected light, beside an underground stream. He stood there for 5 full minutes without speaking. "This changes things," he finally said. "This changes what we think is possible." Bernard wrote a report. The State Extension Service sent a team. Virginia Tech sent a professor of horticulture named Dr. Louise Painter, who spent 3 days in the cavern measuring light levels, water chemistry, soil composition, and growth rates. Her findings, published in a state agricultural bulletin in 1941, confirmed what I already knew. The cavern environment produced greens that were nutritionally denser than surface-grown equivalents, likely due to the mineral content of the limestone water and the slower, steadier growth rate in the cool, stable temperature. Dr. Painter became a friend and ally. She helped me expand the growing area, introducing new varieties suited to low-light conditions. She connected me with researchers studying underground agriculture in Europe, and she gave my work a name that made people take it seriously: subterranean controlled environment agriculture. It sounded better than "girl grows lettuce in a hole." The war years cemented the garden's importance. With men gone and supplies rationed, the valley needed every source of food it could get. My underground garden produced through every season: winter, spring, summer, fall, without interruption. I trained 3 families from the Hollow to build their own mirror systems in abandoned wells and mine shafts. By 1944, there were 5 underground growing sites in the Upper Valley, all using the techniques I'd developed from that first cracked hand mirror and a French book I'd read in an orphanage. I married Virgil's nephew, a man named Colton Sloan, in 1945. He had come home from the Pacific with shrapnel in his leg and a quietness that matched mine. Not the silence of someone who has nothing to say, but the silence of someone who has seen too much and chooses his words the way a carpenter chooses nails, each one placed with care. He understood the cave the way Virgil did, practically, physically, and he understood me the way nobody else had, completely, without requiring explanation. We married on the ridge above the well in October, with the maples burning red and the sound of the underground stream humming faintly beneath our feet. We raised 2 children in Arlo's cabin, which Colton expanded into a proper house with timber from our own hillside and stone from the same limestone that lined the well shaft. Virgil died in 1948, peacefully, on his porch in September, with the smell of apples in the air. I buried him on the ridge above the well, and Colton carved the headstone from the same limestone that lined the shaft. It read, "He brought the light down. The underground garden grew, in size, in reputation, in influence." By the 1950s, we had expanded the original cavern by opening 2 additional chambers, connected by natural passages, tripling the growing area. Colton engineered a mirror system using polished aluminum reflectors that captured 3 times the light of my original mismatched collection. We grew not just greens now, but herbs, root vegetables, and even strawberries in the warmest chamber. Tiny, intensely sweet strawberries that people drove from 3 counties away to buy. In 1962, I published a book, The Living Well: Underground Agriculture in Appalachia, with Dr. Painter's help. It documented everything: the mirror systems, the water chemistry, the growing techniques, the year-round production data. It sold modestly but reached the people who needed it: small farmers, extension agents, researchers, communities looking for ways to grow food in marginal land. Letters came from across the country, from people who had dry wells and abandoned mines and dead land that everybody said was worthless. I answered everyone, some with advice, some with seeds, some with nothing more than the encouragement that comes from one person saying to another, I know what it's like to stand over a dry hole and believe there's nothing left. Keep digging. The water moved, but it didn't leave. Colton passed in 1976 on a spring evening, with our children beside him and the sound of water running through the pipe he'd laid from the cavern 30 years before. I buried him next to Virgil on the ridge. Two good men, uncle and nephew, both of whom had believed a 15-year-old girl when she told them there was something at the bottom of a dry well. I kept working. I was 65 by then, and my knees wouldn't let me climb the well shaft anymore, so my son built a proper staircase. Stone steps cut into the lateral passage with a handrail and electric lights powered by a small generator. The cavern that I'd first seen by torchlight was now a proper facility, visited by hundreds of people a year. School groups came. University students came. A film crew from public television came in 1979 and made a documentary that aired across Appalachia. I died in the autumn of 1983 at 72 in the house that Colton built. My daughter found me at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and one of Arlo's old geology books open to the chapter on limestone karst formations, the same chapter that had started everything 47 years before. She said I looked like someone who had finished reading a long and complicated story and finally understood the ending. The well is still flowing. The garden is still growing. My granddaughter manages the operation now. Expanded, modernized, but still rooted in the same principle I discovered as a 15-year-old girl sitting at the bottom of a shaft everyone said was empty. There is no such thing as a dried-up well. There is only a well whose water has found a different path. And if you're willing to follow the water, to go down into the dark, to squeeze through the narrow places, to look for life where everyone else sees stone, you will find that the earth has been keeping something for you all along. On the stone cover that once sealed the well, the one scratched with the words, "No water." Don't bother. My children mounted a brass plate. It reads, Alma Gentry Sloan went to the bottom. She found everything. So let me ask you this. What have you been told is empty? What well in your life have you stopped looking into because someone scratched a warning on the cover and you believed them? What would happen if you ignored the warning, rigged a rope, and went down anyway? Because here's what I learned. The people who write "no water" on the cover are almost always the people who never climbed down to check. They looked at the surface, saw nothing, and declared the matter closed. They didn't go deeper. They didn't look sideways. They didn't consider that the water might still be there, just flowing in a direction nobody expected. The well is not empty. It has never been empty. The water just moved, and it's waiting for someone brave enough to follow it. If this story stirred something in you, if it made you think about the wells you've given up on and the depths you haven't explored, hit subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who went to the bottom and found what everyone else had missed. Your well isn't dry. You just haven't gone deep enough. Start climbing down.